Good morning, 7th and 8th graders. We are here to finish out Chapter 8 of American History, Section 4, the War of 1812. We are on page 284 in your books, and on page 285 you're going to see a map, which is going to be really useful and important. So while you're watching this, you should have your notes out, have your book open, but have your map on 285 kind of marked somehow, maybe with a sticky note, just because you're going to want to be able to go back and refer to that map. So, in the summer of 1812, it became pretty obvious that we were going to go to war, and in fact, by that point, we were at war. We were in a war with one of the world's most powerful nations during this time period, and really even up through the 20th century. Great Britain, this tiny little island, couple of islands, was one of the most powerful nations in the world, and our brand new country was at war with Great Britain. Now, the Warhawks had claimed that this would be a quick war, that it would be an easy war. They were wrong. It's called the War of 1812, but it lasted a lot longer than 1812. So, let's talk about this. When the war began, the British Navy had hundreds of ships. The British Navy was the envy of the world. This was the greatest navy in the world at the time, and the Brits were understandably proud of their navy. They were very good, very well trained, fast ships, excellent commanders. Just everything about the British Navy was something to be proud of. The U.S. Navy, in comparison, was very small, extremely small. But we did have well-trained sailors and some powerful new warships. For instance, we talked about this in the last section, the USS Constitution, also known as Old Ironsides, was brand new during this war and was state-of-the-art for its time. It's really interesting, really funny, kind of, that the U.S. was able to defeat British ships several times in kind of these one-on-one matches. These victories did a lot to embarrass the British, and they did a lot to bolster American confidence during this time period. So eventually the British ships blockaded U.S. seaports, America's seaports. Now, I have the definition of the word blockade up here, and I want you to write that down in your notes. A blockade is the use of ships or troops to prevent movement into and out of a port or region controlled by a hostile nation. So the Brits would position their ships around American ports so that American ships couldn't get out or in, and this was very damaging to American trade. At the same time, stuff is happening up in Canada. Now, this is kind of a little bit silly, I think, to me. Of course, it's easy for me looking back on it to go, you guys, what were you thinking? But they were hoping that they could follow up these victories that we had at sea with some land victories. They wanted Canada. The idea was that if they could get Canada, we would have more land, more room to spread out. So they had 3 attacks planned: Detroit, Niagara Falls, and up the Hudson River toward Montreal. So you can look on page 285, your map, and you can see these different battle sites. The attack from Detroit failed miserably. British soldiers and Indians, led by Tecumseh, remember him, captured Fort Detroit. So not only did we not succeed in our battle, but we also lost some territory. The other American attacks just failed because state militia troops refused to cross the Canadian border. They were like, no, we don't have the right to fight in a foreign country, so we're not going to. In 1813, the U.S. went on the attack again, and their goal was to break British control of Lake Erie. This is one of the Great Lakes. It's actually the smallest of the Great Lakes, if I remember correctly, and but the British had control of it, and Lake Erie was really important for trade, among other things. And so the idea was we're going to take Lake Erie, and the Navy gave the task to a man named Oliver Perry. Oliver Perry was a Commodore. That is a naval title, and Commodore is abbreviated CDRE. CDRE stands for Commodore. Oliver Hazard Perry. It's a cool middle name, Hazard. He was hazardous to the British, let me tell you. Commodore Perry was a brilliant sailor and a brilliant commander, and he led the American Navy at the Battle of Lake Erie. So Perry sails out to meet the British on September 10th, and this begins the Battle of Lake Erie. And so you've got these two things on your notes here. The Battle of Lake Erie, U.S. versus Great Britain. The battle ended when the U.S. Navy forced the British surrender, and the U.S. gained control of Lake Erie. One of the things that Commodore Perry said to General William Henry Harrison was, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." He's a pretty confident guy. And so the Battle of Lake Erie ended with an American win. Ended with an American win. If you want to mark that with the letter A, it's kind of the same way we did when we were taking notes on the Revolutionary War. We would mark battles with a B if Great Britain won, or an A if the Americans won. In this case, the U.S. won the Battle of Lake Erie. So we've established control of Lake Erie. So General Harrison marches his army into Canada, and at the Battle of the Thames River, and that is how that's pronounced, believe it or not. Looks like Thames. At the Battle of the Thames River, Harrison was able to defeat a combined British and Native American force. Harrison's victory here at the Battle of the Thames River, the Americans won. Spoiler alert. At the Battle of the Thames, his victory ended British power in the Northwest. The Northwest Territory, which is what they call the area around the Great Lakes. It ended British power there. And Tecumseh died in this battle. And the death of Tecumseh was just a huge blow to the Native Americans in the region, because Tecumseh was really kind of their rallying point. And when he died, they lost a lot of power in that area and just a lot of confidence in themselves. Moving south, we've got the Creek War, and I'm going to erase this because it's important for me to keep things up toward the top. So you can always pause me and go back if you want, if you feel like you missed anything. The Creek War. The War with the American Indians erupted in the South. Creek Indians, the Creek tribe, they were angry. They were angry at American settlers for pushing into their lands, and they got their guns and took up arms in 1813. There's a large force of Creek Indians that attacked a fort, Fort Mims, on the Alabama River. So we're talking way down south, right? So we've started in Canada, and now we're down here. And they destroyed the fort, and they killed a lot of people. In fact, they killed nearly 250 Americans at that fort. Now, in response, there was a man named Andrew Jackson. You've heard of him. He's on your $20 bill. Although, there's a movement to take him off and put someone else on. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not opposed to that. Andrew Jackson is an interesting guy, and you may or may not continue to like him as we continue to study. But Andrew Jackson actually ended up being president number 7. President number 7. But Andrew Jackson was the commander of the Tennessee militia, and he was the commander during the Creek War. He led the troops, and he won at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. This was where Jackson attacked the Creek Nation along the Tallapoosa, that's hard to say, Tallapoosa River down in Alabama. They won the battle. This particular battle, like I said, was called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And they ended the Creek War with the Treaty of Fort Jackson. The Treaty of Fort Jackson. The Treaty of Fort Jackson was signed in late 1814, and it ended the Creek War, and it forced the Creek Nation to give up millions of acres of land to the U.S. government. This is only the beginning of Andrew Jackson's dealings with Native Americans, and it doesn't get much better, to be honest. So, the U.S. is having some success in the west and in the southern frontiers, but the situation on the East Coast is getting very dicey for the U.S. because Great Britain had been at war with France, and because Great Britain was at war with France, they couldn't really focus on this little skirmish in the U.S. But in 1814, they defeated Napoleon, and then they were able to send more troops to America. So they attacked Washington, D.C. This is a really, I don't know, cool is the right word, but when they attacked Washington, D.C., they broke for the U.S. defenses, set fire to the White House, set fire to the Capitol, set fire to other governmental buildings, and in fact, James Madison, who was the president, had to flee. One of the coolest things about this, maybe the only cool thing and more, is that Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, refused to leave until a specific painting was safe. There was a very famous painting of George Washington. In fact, if you go with us on our next trip to Washington, D.C., you will be able to see this particular painting. It's a large painting. I'm not sure if it's life-size, but if it's not, it's pretty close. And Dolly Madison said, "I'm not leaving without this painting." And she refused to leave until the painting was secured. In fact, let me say, it was, let's see. On August 24th, 1814, American troops were defeated in the Battle of Bladensburg. I'm reading from this little book here. This is a great book. In fact, I highly recommend that you get it just because it's a really good digest, short and easy to read of U.S. history. Anyway, the Battle of Bladensburg, because the Brits won, they were able to sail into the Chesapeake Bay, invade Washington, D.C., set fire to the Capitol and the White House, forced President Madison to flee. Dolly Madison stayed behind until the very last moment to save a portrait of George Washington. She was bound and determined that she would not leave until that portrait was safe, which I think is kind of she was a cool chick. I gotta say, in everything I've read about Dolly Madison, she was a woman with whom you did not want to tangle. She was a strong woman, and I think James Madison wouldn't have been half the man he was without her. So you should look her up sometime, read a little bit about her. I'd say the same thing about Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams as well. Those women were fit wives for presidents, for sure. So, the British sailed on to Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland was guarded by a fort called Fort McHenry. They shelled the fort for 25 hours. The Americans refused to surrender Fort McHenry. The British chose to retreat instead of continuing to fight. Now, I believe, just one second. Yes, this is where I need to talk about this. This is on the back of your notes, and I actually think when I sent this out in the email, I think I forgot to copy the back. So you've got your front, and the back should have three things on it: Treaty of Ghent, Francis Scott Key, and the three consequences of the War of 1812. So I'm going to talk about Francis Scott Key, even though we've skipped a few things, because this is where he belongs in time. After the battle before the British attack on Baltimore, when Fort McHenry was attacked, the Americans raised a large flag over Fort McHenry, a big flag. In fact, this flag is in the Museum of American History, the Smithsonian Museum of American History. You can go in and you can see this very flag. When the British shelled, when they bombed, cannon fire, the Fort McHenry for 25 hours, this is when Francis Scott Key, who was a lawyer, witnessed the night-long bombardment. So they are sending cannon fire all night long. And when he looked up in the morning and saw that the flag was still there, he was so incredibly moved by that he wrote a poem. And that poem became our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. We only usually sing the first verse, but there are 4 stanzas to this poem. And I did send it in the email, I believe, originally. If you didn't get it and you want a copy of it, I'd be happy to send that to you. Let me know. But it is a moving poem. The whole poem is pretty interesting, pretty cool, and just a lovely thing. And I hope that as many of you are able to come with us next spring break, next year, to Washington, D.C. I hope you're able to do that, and I hope we're able to fit in a visit to that particular museum so that you can see this flag, because it was really moving. I remember the first time I saw it. Okay, back to Great Britain on the offensive. So we're talking about now the Battle of New Orleans. This is actually as funny as things can get in war. I mean, we are talking about war. People are dying here. But the fact is that the Battle of New Orleans didn't actually have to happen. The British moved against New Orleans after the attack on Washington. They wanted to capture the city because, remember, New Orleans was really important. It was at the mouth of the Mississippi River. It was a big, busy, important port. It still is. And the British knew that if they could control that, they could control American trade and take control of the Mississippi River. Andrew Jackson, once again, commanded the U.S. forces around New Orleans. This is really fascinating to me, because as much trouble as Andrew Jackson would give the Native Americans later on, he was sure okay with having them in his army. His troops included not only Americans, but 2 battalions of free African Americans, a group of Choctaw Indians, some state militiamen, and a group of pirates led by a man named Jean Lafitte. A group of pirates, of all things. Yes, I am not kidding. You can look up Jean Lafitte and you can see he's, again, a pretty fascinating character. So the battle begins on the morning of January 8th, 1815. Around 5,300 British troops attacked Jackson's force. Jackson had about 4,500 troops. So the British had about 1,000 more, approximately. But they made a couple of mistakes. They began marching toward the U.S. defenses, but they were caught in an open field, and the U.S. forces cut them down with absolutely frightening speed. In fact, over 2,000 British soldiers were killed, and only 70 U.S. soldiers were killed. Now, that's, 70 too many and 2,000 too many, but it was a pretty amazing accomplishment for Andrew Jackson, and it made him a war hero and was the last major conflict of the War of 1812. The most ironic thing about it is something that we're about to get to. Okay, so before the Battle of New Orleans, so let's go back in time just a smidge. Before the Battle of New Orleans, there was a group of Federalists, remember that was one of the political parties, a group of Federalists from New England who gathered secretly at Hartford, Connecticut. And they had a little convention called the Hartford Convention. And at the Hartford Convention, they agreed to oppose the war and send delegates to meet with Congress, right? So we think this war is a bad idea. We're not doing very well. We think we should stop. We think we should make peace with Great Britain. But before the delegates from the Hartford Convention could get to Washington, news arrived that the war had ended. This was sort of a death blow to the Federalist Party because people were kind of laughing at them now, and the Federalists lost a lot of their political power because of this. Now, communication at the time was very slow. Okay, remember, we don't have telegraphs, we don't have telephones, we don't have the internet, we don't have anything like that. So we've got horses and riders, we've got boats. There's not a quick way to get messages anywhere. Because of the slow communication at the time, neither the Federalists nor Andrew Jackson down in New Orleans knew about the Treaty of Ghent. And this is on the back side of your page. The Treaty of Ghent. Ghent is a city in Belgium, and the treaty was signed in Ghent, Belgium on December 24th, 1814, ending the War of 1812. The Battle of New Orleans happened January 8th, 1815. So all of those people died basically for nothing. It's kind of funny in a sad way, for sure. Another kind of ironic and sad thing about this war is that, well, it's technically ironic, but it's very definitely sad, is that nobody gained any territory, nobody lost any territory. We fought for basically nothing. But the fighting did have several consequences, and I want to talk about the three consequences of the War of 1812. Three main consequences of the War of 1812. The first is that it produced feelings of patriotism in Americans. Can't write and talk at the same time. Patriotism, this sort of intense love for country, and this was the first time that Americans had really thought of themselves as Americans. The second thing is that it broke the power of many Native American groups. So it weakened the Native Americans. Many of the Native American groups, especially in the Northwest Territories around the Great Lakes and in the South, were greatly weakened by the War of 1812. And then the third thing was that it boosted American manufacturing. If we couldn't buy stuff from Great Britain because we were fighting with them, we had to make it ourselves. And so industry took hold during this time period. Because there was this lack in trade, U.S. factories had to step up to make things. And so what you end up having is, while we didn't gain any new territory, we gained a lot of things in terms of uniting as a country. At what price? That's a good question. And we're going to wrap this chapter up now, and we will, in chapter 9, be talking about moving forward as a nation. We're going to talk about nationalism and sectionalism, and some of the ideas of states' rights are going to come up, and we're going to kind of become a more cohesive country as that goes. And we'll see you next week.